It's Wednesday, June 1st, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, the back and forth about the editing on Katie Couric's documentary, Under the Gun. We'll talk about a single cut and how that's called its credibility into question. Former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder appears to have a change of heart, going on the record saying that the NSA leaker, Edward Snowden, provided a public service. What might that signal for whistleblowers? And Roots returns to cable television. We'll talk about the reboot running this week on the History Channel, A&E, and Lifetime. There's a lot more, hopefully, that we'll get to as well, but let's start with Gawker. We've talked a lot about that site recently. It's breaking news about Facebook's trending topics, the likelihood that contractors suppressed conservative news, about how its sports site, Deadspin, uncovered shoddy reporting about Daniel Holtzclaw, that college football player turned Oklahoma police officer convicted of serial rape of black women, and the defamation suit it lost to Hulk Hogan. That defeat could ultimately mean the end for the site. Well, we're learning a lot more as Gawker tries to appeal the decision about that case and why a billionaire, who isn't Hulk Hogan, bankrolled the lawsuit with a secret plan to destroy Gawker. Peter Thiel is one of the founders of PayPal and one of the earliest investors in Facebook. He's reportedly worth just shy of $3 billion, and he's been holding a grudge against Gawker since 2007, when a post on its Valleywag blog outed him as gay. Revenge is a dish best served cold. What exactly was his plan here?
Well, I mean, basically, he's paid, $10 million so far, basically, so that Hulk Hogan could sue over the sex tape. And so far, Hogan has won. There's been, $120 million judgment or something like that against him that could bankrupt the company. And Thiel basically did it, he says, partly because he was outed by Gawker's blog back in the day, but also because he claims he wants to be a third party to help sort of set the record right and perhaps change the rules on what the media can say about people without their permission. And so I don't know who you want to believe here. The thing for me is bad stories lead sometimes to good case law, and this story is bad. I mean, what Gawker did with Hulk Hogan, I don't think anybody would say that was a legitimate story. What they did in outing Peter Thiel, I don't know, you say what you like. I don't think outing gay people in power just because you can is good journalism either. But does that mean that we should empower all these rich billionaires from Silicon Valley to say our solution is we're going to take you out of business? That's pretty dangerous.
Well, I think the one of the problems here is that this is setting a precedent that if you have a huge amount of money and you're willing to spend it, that you can actually take a media company to court and win in the way of making a judgment so large that there's no way that they can stay in business and do that. I mean, this sort of goes back to the Sullivan case where you had those who were trying to maintain segregation who filed a lawsuit against the New York Times, and their goal there was to basically bankrupt the New York Times to keep it from covering the civil rights movement back in the 1960s.
I mean, clearly there's nothing illegal with spending your money to try to change the law
and
through
$10 million
lawsuits.
is a drop in the bucket when you have a net worth of
and there are lots
nearly
of causes
$3 billion.
depending on your political point of view where third parties coming in to provide the funding have perhaps changed the law in good ways. But the thing that I guess sort of bothers me is that despite its sort of terrible track record, Gawker does do some good journalism. And even, Nick Denton, who I think probably was trying to defend the indefensible in the Hulk Hogan case, had some interesting things and true things to say about Silicon Valley and their leaders. I mean, basically, they're used to an acquiescent press that just does a lot of positive spin on their products, doesn't really raise a lot of questions. And this is not the kind of journalism that Gawker was doing.
So this has become an issue that has pretty deeply divided Silicon Valley. Pierre Omidyar, who is, he started The Intercept, the founder of eBay, he's actually come out in support of Gawker.
Well, yeah, I think what's happening here is that the Silicon Valley and that environment, they're starting to mature. They're becoming a mature company, a mature sort of conglomerate. And what happens with that is that you're going to get some attention, and the media is beginning to ask questions and to cover them in the way in which they've covered traditional corporations like the auto industry or the steel industry and that sort of thing. So I think you're starting to see that, and Gawker was out front in doing that, and they aren't used to that kind of scrutiny. Now, I agree with Mike that some of the stories that Gawker does, I mean, the Thiel outing him, Hulk Hogan, and there are others, is not the kind of journalism that I would want to sort of espouse or even support.
Or attach your name to.
Yeah, attach your name to. But on an ethical, in an ethical way, you've got to think about, is it good for journalism as a whole to actually support something like this?
So interestingly enough, I mentioned Pierre Omidyar and creating The Intercept, Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, buying the Washington Post. Does journalism need this big tech money? Is that what we're going to be relying on as we move forward?
Yeah,
how does that factor into this?
I think this is one of the bigger stories that this Thiel piece sort of points out. Whether it's relying on those new owners like Bezos, or John Henry at the Boston Globe. I mean, you either have to rely on these tech moguls to bring money to prop up traditional journalism, or we have to rely on them as distribution channels. I mean, Facebook basically is the 800-pound gorilla for almost every publisher now. And whether we like it or not, companies like Facebook and Apple and Google are basically creating the distribution channels that we need to reach new audiences.
Well, and I read something today, too, that as one of the early investors in Facebook, Thiel holds a seat on that board, and at the end of next month, there's going to be an up or down vote as to whether or not he retains that seat. So in some ways, he has even more control in this situation than it even appears just on the surface with Gawker.
Well, I think to me, I think Mike is right. This is going to be the problem that the traditional media has in terms of who's actually going to be in control of the purse strings. And right now, the tech giants have the money, and they also control the distribution in ways that will allow them to have control. Ultimately, what you could have is you could have these sort of regional media operations, and then a couple of national media operations that are all controlled by tech moguls who control both the distribution, and now they're actually going to be in control of the editorial and the content.
I think the other big story for me that's interesting from this is this is one more chapter in this kind of depressing narrative of late of rich and powerful people thinking that they can take on the media with impunity in some ways that are pretty new. I mean, we're going to talk about Trump in a little bit, but basically because people see the press as just one more tainted institution that can't be trusted, people can lay into us not only as an institution, but as individuals and get away with saying things that they couldn't have said in the past.
What I think makes it even more damaging is that not only can they lay into us in terms of criticizing what we do as a media, you also have these people who can actually control it in monetary ways. Yeah. And that is the real danger, because if they can control it in that regard, then they can control what's actually going out there and what the public is actually being able to consume and use.
Well, a few weeks ago, Yahoo News anchor Katie Couric was making the rounds promoting her new gun safety documentary, Under the Gun. When it debuted at Sundance last year, that film was billed as, quote, scrupulously comprehensive and decidedly fair to both sides on one of the most polarizing issues tearing our country apart. Not so much anymore after the Washington Free Beacon published this audio. You're about to hear Couric ask members of the Virginia Citizens Defense League about background checks.
Let me ask you another question. If there are no background checks for gun purchasers, how do you prevent felons or terrorists from purchasing a gun?
You listen to that extended pause, and it's natural to think that the participants are speechless. That's not what happened during the interview, though. No, they answered right away, and the director and editor told Couric during a screening they added that beat, that second or two between her question and their answer for dramatic effect. In your opinion, how does this hurt or not hurt the credibility of the film?
Well, it places it out of context. If she posed a question and they answered the question, that's the way you should air it. You shouldn't put something in there for dramatic effect. Now, I understand that this is a documentary and it's not a news segment like on 60 Minutes or something like that, but it's the concept is still there. You're presenting information to the public. You need to present that information in the context in which it happened, and that didn't happen here. And Katie Couric is having to deal with the fallout from that right now.
I mean, all documentaries have a point of view. That's what makes them a documentary, and this one does. That's okay. I don't have any problem with that. But to me, it's the deliberate manipulation of facts. It's a problem. I mean, Couric acknowledged later that she asked the director, why did you put that pause in there? And when it was explained, well, we did it for dramatic effect or whatever, she didn't say, oh no, as the executive producer of that documentary, she didn't say take it out. She only gave a full-throated apology for it after the people who were interviewed said, we have our own tape that shows that we answered the question.
And it wasn't even right after that person was interviewed and that group was interviewed and said that. She stood behind this edit for several days before issuing, I don't know that I want to use the word apology, but an explanation, if you will, on the documentary's website. You can read that in full on our links blog, but she really did stand by that for several days.
I will say that when whatever precipitated it, when she finally issued her full apology, it was a full apology. We talk about apologies, fake apologies on this show all the time. And when you look at the apology that the director made, says, I never intended to make anyone look bad, and I apologize if anyone felt that way. That's totally disingenuous. Katie Couric apologized in detail, not making any excuses. It's just too bad it had to get to the point where another tape had to surface to challenge the veracity of the documentary before she'd do that.
Well, the part that I don't understand is that if she saw it in the taping where she saw the version that was going to be presented to the public and questioned it then, why didn't they say, wait a minute, let's rethink this? They had an opportunity to do that. Why did you feel the need to have the dramatic effect there? And to me, this apology of, well, we wanted the public to think about it right after the question was posed so that they can decide what they thought about it and then give the answer from the citizens group. That made no sense to me. That was I don't know.
Especially because if you're thinking about it, you're not going to reach a conclusion.
Exactly.
And what was that pause before the magazine or the turning of the bullets in the gun, and then the music started? What?
Exactly.
3 seconds. You're not going to come to a conclusion.
It wasn't just the fact that you had to pause there, but it was the music that came after it and the scene that came after it. You were trying to make a statement. That was not about giving the public time to come up with an answer in their own head.
And the thing, why did you need to do that? I mean, I haven't seen the full documentary, but from what people have said, it does a good job of trying to make the case that there is a consensus, maybe even a consensus on background checks that American gun owners can agree with. Maybe the NRA doesn't, but a lot of gun owners do. And then you put this thing out here with this manipulation inside the documentary, and you've blown away the message you were trying to convey.
And that's what really bothers me about this, is that now we're sitting here talking about this 8-second pause in the middle of this documentary that actually, I think, does a pretty good job of saying, here's the gun issue from various perspectives. And to talk about gun violence, which is a huge topic, not only in the presidential election, but also in a lot of local and state house races where you're talking about how do we deal with the issue of gun violence within our communities. And this is a piece of the overall puzzle that could actually shed some light on that. But it's lost because of what happened here.
What's that they say? 1-0, that word wipes out 10 attaboys.
Right.
We're focusing on the 8 seconds. It was about 3 years ago that we sat down at this table and first said Edward Snowden's name. Since then, we have a whole new view of government surveillance of U.S. citizens and how the telecom industry was complicit in it. Snowden is now living in exile in Russia under threat of prosecution for treason. Yet former U.S. Attorney Eric Holder says Edward Snowden performed a public service in starting a global dialogue over surveillance techniques. This all came out in a conversation between Holder and David Axelrod on the Axe Files. That's a podcast that's produced by CNN and the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. Mind you, Holder also said that the act of leaking this information was illegal and Snowden should still be punished, but he's also saying this kind of needed to happen.
Yeah, I think what he's basically saying is that we needed to have a conversation about surveillance and about the government's use of various techniques to spy on average citizens and to spy on in various ways that may or may not have been above board and in some cases against the law. That part I understand. But then he starts dialing it back to say, well, but he didn't follow proper procedure. He violated some laws. He needs to come back to answer for those. So it's almost like he's trying to give himself an out, but that's not what he was saying, nor what the Obama administration was saying when Eric Holder was Attorney General.
I'll give Holder credit for giving a more nuanced response to a question about Snowden, certainly a more nuanced approach than anybody in the Obama administration has given, or that he did when he was in office. Of course, it's easier for him to say these things when he's no longer in office. And basically what he's saying to Snowden is, hey, come on back. You're going to be convicted, but I think the judge should take into consideration when he sentences you the fact that you've started this dialogue. Well, that's probably cold comfort for Snowden, who thinks, I want to get a fair trial if I'm going to come back. And the problem is that Snowden has been charged under the Espionage Act, just like Daniel Ellsberg from the Pentagon Papers. And now, Ellsberg was acquitted, but he very easily might not have been. And so imagine what happens to you. You can't put up a good defense, or at least as good a defense as you like, under the Espionage Act as if he'd been charged with some other breach of security.
Well, and interesting enough is Snowden's reaction to this. He had tweeted, and that tweet breaks down the changes in attitude towards his actions between 2013 and now, saying in 2013 it's treason, 2014 maybe not, but it was reckless, 2015 still technically it was unlawful, 2016 it was a public service but, and then 2017 completely blank.
Well, it's going to be interesting because 2017 you could either have Donald Trump or you could have Hillary Clinton, and I don't think either one of them is going to be as hospitable to Eric Snowden as the Obama administration and Eric Holder.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that they could be any less hospitable, but I don't know that they'll be any more hospitable.
Right.
And this is, post 9/11, post Al Qaeda, the ISIS era, I don't know that you can get a fair trial as Ellsberg, got in the Pentagon Papers case.
We're talking about the Espionage Act. He's been indicted for that, but if he comes back, they could throw some other charges on top of that, including, harboring, not harboring terrorism, but inciting terrorism.
Yeah, well, and one of the other things, too, that I wanted to ask you about this is the Obama administration has been among the hardest on whistleblowers of any in recent history. Does this signify some kind of a change potentially?
I don't think it's a change within this administration when they're headed out the door. It would be interesting to see what the next administration is, how they're going to be in terms of this kind of action or in dealing with the press in general. If you look at, we're going to talk about Trump in a minute, but if you look at the way Trump is going at it and the fact that Hillary Clinton doesn't like the press at all, I think it's going to be more of the same, if not even more ratcheted up. In terms of dealing with the press.
I'd agree with that. And I think there's one other really interesting media angle to this story I'd like to touch on just a little bit before we leave it. And that's the fact that we hear Holder revealing his feelings about this in a podcast with David Axelrod, a former administration official.
Yes.
And to me, that says something about the value of having this diverse, fragmented media environment where we have, quote, real traditional journalists, and we have a lot of non-traditional journalists, and we have former government officials all weighing in. We wouldn't have probably gotten Eric Holder to say this when he said it if he wasn't in front of a more friendly interrogator.
Right, and if I remember correctly, David Axelrod runs the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics in addition to his work as a paid commentator for CNN. Right. So the fact that this is a podcast that is produced as a collaboration between the two, he was truly in a friendly environment and may have even viewed himself as sitting down, having a cup of coffee and talking to a buddy, and there just happened to be some microphones
And he
involved.
may have been a lot more open with David Axelrod than he would have been, say,
with you or with me or with Mike.
Wolf Blitzer or whomever.
Exactly, yes.
Well, remember a few months back, Donald Trump backed out of a primary debate and held a pep rally of sorts. It was a fundraiser for veterans. Well, there's been a lot of questions lately as to how much was actually raised and where that money's gone. Trump held a news conference yesterday morning to address it. Well, let's just say things escalated quickly. Mother Jones described the scene as a shouting match between the candidate and reporters. Hyperbole? Maybe, but here's a bit of what went down when CNN's Jim Acosta asked a question.
I didn't want the credit for it, but it was very unfair that the press treated us so badly. Yeah, go ahead.
To follow up on that, you keep calling us the dishonest press, the disgusting
Well,
press.
generally speaking, that's 100% true. Go ahead.
I disagree with that, sir. And if I can ask you this question, it seems as though you're resistant to scrutiny, the kind of scrutiny that comes with running for president of the United States.
I
You're
like
saying
scrutiny, but you know what? When I raise money,
veterans-
excuse me, I've watched you on television. You're a real beauty.
And the Daily Mail's David Martosco had a follow-up.
I think you've set a new bar today for being contentious with the press corps, kind of calling us losers to our faces and all that.
No, not all of you, just many of you.
All right, fine. Enough of us. Is this what?
Not you, David.
Is this what it's going to be like covering
Yeah,
you if
it
you're
is.
president?
Yeah, it is.
Let
me tell
we're
you
going to have this kind of
something.
confrontation
I'm a
in the
person-
press room?
Okay, yeah, it is going to be like this, David. If the press writes false stories, like they did with this, because, you know, half of you are amazed that I raised all of this money.
Mind you, a lot of that money was raised and not actually dispersed until late last week once these questions started running. I guess this is how it's going to be.
And if you listen very carefully to that last answer he gave, he started out by saying, if the press writes false stories to justify his attacking the press. They didn't write false stories. Here's what they did.
Okay.
They asked, where's this money you said that you were going to give to veterans organizations? Which organizations have you given it to? When did you give it to them?
How much
Are
did
those
you give them?
organizations legitimate? How much did you give? Those are pretty legitimate questions. Those are not, quote, telling false stories. And yet, this is what we're going to get?
This is what we're going to get because story after story after story. I mean, we're talking about the money that he supposedly was going to give to the veterans that apparently he gave. That's the story of today. Yesterday also is about Trump University and the fact that he's going after the judge in that case and basically saying that the judge is wrong. So it's going to be one thing after another. I mean, we talk a lot about the slow drip of stories.
So he's
this
now
is going to
going-
be like a
So he's now going after the media, and he's going after the judiciary, which is another one of the branches of government with which we have checks and balances.
I mean, I think this is what we're going to get. This is going to be the campaign of Donald Trump. The question becomes, how do we engage Hillary into this campaign? How does she fit into this? Because she doesn't want to play in this sort of circus that is Donald Trump. But the media is sort of falling into it. Look at the line of questioning. Well, you came out and you attacked us. You called us this name. You called us that name. And so now you've got this back and forth going on between Donald Trump and the media, and none of the issues are getting talked about, nor is he even talking about his opponent.
Well, and in a lot of ways, Donald Trump, it feels like, is playing us. A tete-a-tete like this benefits him in a lot of ways, especially when you think about all of those Pew Research studies that are out there that say that the general public doesn't trust the media. So that supporters, the supporters he has, that part of the populace that's already angry, he's just giving them another avenue at which to direct the anger because they don't like us to begin with either.
Right. And I don't really know that the media writing a lot of stories complaining about how the media is being treated, although those are fair stories and he isn't treating the media properly. I don't think that's getting us anywhere any more than any of the other outrageous things he said, because there is a vein in American public right now that is so fed up that they're willing to support him regardless of what he does or says. And so he's mastered it. And as you say, on the one hand, he's completely tearing down the media. At the other, he's manipulating us in masterful ways that we're allowing to have happen because we're comfortable with news conferences and we love it when somebody comes out and we don't know what they're going to say. Are they going to make news? We never know what he's going to say.
That Howard Stern effect that we've been talking about with him for the last 8-9 months, it's just continuing to build.
Right. I mean, basically what you have here is that he has a press conference. The media ask him questions. He sees the questions as attack, and then they go back and forth at each other, and this sort of drama that goes on, and the media falls for it because, as Mike said, we're doing the press conferences instead of doing the journalism, instead of doing the investigative pieces about what has he done as a business person. following up on all the claims that he's made, those types of things.
I agree with all of that, and we're kind of lazy these days, and we'd rather just have talking heads reacting to news conferences all day long. On the other hand, it's not the media's job to convince Hillary Clinton that she ought to come out and talk to the press every once in a while. She hasn't had a news conference. Trump has had all kinds of them. Some of them are circuses like this last one, but she hasn't had any. She likes to control the message, and a lot of her aides, past and present, say she hates the news media. Well, if she wants to run her campaign and take her chances that way, there's nothing much the media can do about it except be scrupulously fair in the stories we tell and try to give airtime to the stories and not just to the circus.
And I think that's going to be the difficulty, is giving airtime to the stories and not the circus, because what we've seen for the last 8 months is the circus when it comes to Donald Trump.
Okay, well, let's talk about Roots. In January 1977, it captivated American audiences for more than a week, showing for the first time on network television the brutality of slavery and its effect on one family for generations to come. It was a big risk for ABC. Alex Haley's novel sat atop the bestseller list for 22 weeks, but that was no guarantee that a largely white audience would tune in to see a then unknown LeVar Burton being tortured at the hands of white people, or that they'd come back to see his character, Kunta Kinte's descendants, raped, beaten, and swindled for a full week. But get this, when the original series aired, 85% of American homes watched at least some part of the saga, and the finale drew 100 million viewers. Those are numbers almost unimaginable today. Chances are that you've heard about, if not already seen, at least some part of the new Roots, starring Roman Armstrong, another virtual unknown, as Kunta Kinte. LeVar Burton is involved in the reboot, serving as the series' executive producer. Let's listen to why he and some of the others in the cast and crew took on this project now.
There's a gold mine of information available to us now that wasn't available to us when Alex was doing the original research. So Kunta's origin story will be vastly different.
Talking to them about the project and the character and what would be exposed and shown that hadn't been shown before.
This part of history wasn't always taught thoroughly in school. You know, you didn't really get into the nitty-gritty of slavery and the slave trade and just all of the aspects of it.
Not unlike the Holocaust. Part of the reason that people retell that story over and over and over again is to ensure that people don't forget what happened.
Ooh, I'm taking a look at the clock on the wall, and we only have about a minute and a half left in today's show, so we're probably not going to have enough time to really talk about this as much as we might have wanted to or liked to. But I invite our audience listening or watching the show to go ahead and check out our links blog. There are a lot of articles there that have been published by newspapers and different sites all around the globe looking at the issues that come up in this reboot of Roots. Like I said, we are out of time for today, so I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about all of the topics that we did talk about today on our links blog. You can find that under the programs tab at KBIA.org. I also invite you to like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and to listen to our program again. Leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to KBIA's Pat Akers for handling the audio. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.